Okay, my name is Paul Thaler. I am the Director of External Affairs for the National LGBT Bar Association. Thank you for listening in today. This call-in is entitled DACA in Our Communities, What You Need to Know, and is brought to you by the National LGBT Bar Association and the Hispanic National Bar Association's LGBT Division. On this call, our panelists will address the Trump administration's DACA decision and how this will affect the Hispanic and LGBT communities. I very briefly just want to introduce our three speakers and then pass it off to our moderator, who will be Scott Titshaw. So to start, Scott is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and a Professor of Law at Mercer University School of Law in Mason, Georgia. He has written extensively on immigration law, comparative law, and legal issues concerning sexual minorities. Next, we have Marissa Montes, who is the co-director of the Los Angeles Immigrant Justice Clinic at Loyola Law School. Marissa co-founded this community-based clinic, bringing direct immigration legal services through clinical legal education to the east side of Los Angeles. She has also taught courses about cross-cultural competency and trauma-informed lawyering, as well as spearheaded the law school's alternative spring break in El Paso, Texas, where students represented immigrants in removal proceedings. And last but certainly not least, we have Alan Orr Jr., who is the founder and owner of the Orr Immigration Law Firm. He has over 13 years of U.S. and global experience with the immigration practice of one of the largest international law firms. He is the recipient of the 2009 Joseph Minsky Young Lawyer Award for contributions made in the immigration law field. Before we get started, I just want to tell all of our listeners that if you have any questions for our speakers, please email them to me at paul@lgbtbar.org. That's Paul, P-A-U-L, at lgbtbar.org, and we will try to get to them at the end of this call. This call will last about 45 minutes to an hour long, so we have a lot to cover. And with that, I just want to pass it along to Scott to get everything started.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that and appreciate the National LGBT and the Hispanic National Bar Associations for sponsoring this event. We're glad to continue to get the word out about DACA and what's changing now. And I'm going to start out with a very brief introduction of where we've been before sort of moving on to Marissa and Alan talking about where we are now and where we may go. I will start with what I can't believe I'm calling the good old days, which were, and it didn't seem like they were so good at the time, but the 1990s and the early 2000s, when I was a new immigration attorney. I actually practiced immigration for 12 years before moving to become a full-time professor. And back in those days, I also went regularly to the American Immigration Lawyers Association's lobby days, as we called them at the time, in D.C. And every year, we would get very excited about the possibility of comprehensive immigration reform and of legalizing what were then estimated as around 11 or 12 million people who were out of status in the United States. And it really felt like something might happen back then. I'll tell you, the Republicans in Congress tended to, at the time, favor employment-based immigration, which, because of where the labor movement stood at the time, some Democrats opposed. And Democrats tended to favor family-based immigration and humanitarian types of immigration, including asylum and refugees. And there was room to compromise at that point in time. Unfortunately, despite having a president who really pushed for it in the early 2000s with George W. Bush, things changed politically. There was most prominently 9/11, and there was also a lot of grassroots movement pushback on the right against immigration of any type. And things sort of began to fall apart with comprehensive immigration reform and the possibility that we may ever get that at the time. What we were looking at back then, too, was what was considered the low-hanging fruit, which were the dreamers. And this is a sort of a 16-year history, and I'm not going to go through all 16 years of the DREAM Act and DACA. And back then, when the DREAM Act was first introduced in 2001, I remember that people were upset because they thought it might undermine comprehensive immigration reform. They thought it was such an easy pass to recognize and legalize those who were brought to the United States as children, and those are the people who the DREAM Act was meant to cover. So that some people actually opposed it at the time because they thought there was going to be a less compelling argument for comprehensive immigration reform more broadly. The DREAM Act was not successful in 2001 or in any of the years that followed. It actually came close to passage twice. In 2010, the House passed the DREAM Act, and it received 55 votes in the Senate during that Congress. But unfortunately, that was before 55 votes seemed to be enough for enacting legislation, as it seems to be now in a lot of cases. And it was not enacted. Then a little bit later, around 2013, there was another broader bill that included the DREAM Act that passed the Senate, but not the House. So it's actually passed both houses of Congress, just not during the same Congress, which is what's required for legislation to be enacted. In 2012, which I don't think it's a coincidence it was a presidential election year, but President Obama was frustrated by this process, and he apparently decided to do what he thought was possible constitutionally for an executive working alone, and he issued an executive order that was entitled the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's what we're now calling DACA. That was back in 2012, and it was really looked at as a stopgap until the DREAM Act could be enacted, but that has never happened. It's been, people have renewed their DACA status several times. And most recently, last month, President Trump has decided to rescind DACA and announced that in his own executive order. And I'll ask Marissa now, I don't want to dominate the conversation entirely, if she could tell us a little bit about what DACA does, what it is, and what's required.
Yeah, of course, I'd be happy to chat about it. So what I want to start by saying is that DACA is not a form of legal status. People usually think that, DACA means that, it grants the ability for people to get citizenship or residency. Somehow, no, it does not. All that DACA does, it gives you deferment from deportation. And I basically explain it like this way. It's basically you're letting immigration know you're here, or the government know you're here, and they're deciding that you're not a priority for deportation. And in exchange for that, they give you the authority to work. So what's been great is for that these young kids or young adults, that they've been able to get access to work permits, which then gives them access to social security numbers and, in some states, the ability to actually get state identification. DACA also does not grant individuals any form of federal or even state benefits. In the light of those people, in light of applying for state benefits, you actually have to be at the minimum, or at least here in California, I can speak of a legal permanent resident or a U.S. citizen, with the exception if you're a victim of trafficking or a crime. So DACA recipients actually don't get any type of benefits or financial aid, unlike how many of the people that have been talking against DACA say that, these kids have been leeching off of our system. But it's not true. So more than anything, it just grants them the ability to work and exercise their careers and also provide assistance for their family members. Many DACA recipients, especially, I can speak as to my clients, not only support themselves, but also support their extended family, and some even support their own children. So, the fact that DACA is being rescinded doesn't just impact them, it impacts the community. It also, in some instances, DACA did give, at least granted, the opportunity to travel outside of the country. DACA recipients were eligible to apply for something called advanced parole, which basically was permission to leave the United States and then re-enter. DACA recipients were able to do this in the event that they wanted to study abroad or were presented with some sort of like business opportunity that required travel outside of the country. This was great not only because it allowed youth to travel, but also because it allowed people to then lawfully enter the United States. And then, not to get too into detail about immigration law, but in some instances, DACA recipients were then able to basically adjust because they had a lawful entry based on the fact that, a family member or, even sometimes employment businesses were able to petition for them to get their green card.
And Marissa, by adjust, can you explain what that means to people?
Yes.
I think you mean obtaining lawful permanent resident status,
yes.
Right?
So basically what was great about DACA in the event that people were granted advanced parole is that when they re-entered, they then had a lawful entry. And then let's say like they got married to a U.S. citizen, that U.S. citizen family member was then able to petition for them to get their green card. So there were some instances where DACA recipients, were able to use advanced parole to their advantage to then obtain residency. But now, of course, in light of everything going on, we've been advising our clients that even though your DACA is still in effect and you may have been granted advanced parole, you should not travel outside of the United States. So then to address your question as to who does it cover, to go through each element, it was for people who were under the age of 31 as of June 15th, 2012. They had to come to the United States before reaching the age of 16 and have had to reside in the United States from June 2007 until present time. And they must have also have been not having status at the time of the time that they were eligible to apply. And they must have been currently in school or have graduated or obtained some sort of, high school diploma or GED, or have been involved in the armed forces. Also, you can't be convicted of any type of serious criminal conviction. You can't have a felony or even a significant misdemeanor, which included DUIs. So even though we hear a lot of the rhetoric saying, some of these DACA recipients have crimes, in fact, it's actually almost impossible to get DACA in the event that you had any serious criminal conviction. Because even, for example, DUIs in itself don't necessarily serve as an immigration bar, but for the DACA context, you were ineligible for actually applying for it.
So Marissa, yeah. What did people do to apply, and what did they receive when they applied for under the DACA order?
Yeah. So when they applied for DACA, they received deferment from deportation, and then they also received a work permit, employment authorization to work. So those were the two things that individuals received. And then, of course, once you get your work permit, you were able to go forward to apply for your social and, for a state ID or driver's license, depending on the state. But that was the only benefit it granted.
And you mentioned that they could also apply, I think, for advanced parole at that point in time?
Yes. Once they were granted DACA, they were able to apply for advanced parole. But, of course, when you applied for advanced parole wasn't necessarily open to all DACA recipients, because first you have to prove that you actually have a reason for traveling outside of the United States, which usually has to be school-related, so if they studied abroad, business-related, if you had maybe a conference you had to go to for work, or, in humanitarian reasons too, like if it was like a family emergency. Also, it was not open to all DACA recipients because even though you are granted the ability to leave, DACA recipients had to make sure that they had a squeaky clean immigration record because obviously it's discretionary at the border. So that option was not necessarily open to everybody.
Right. So, and now you say that you're not advising people to leave even if they have advanced parole. Is that correct? Yeah, it is correct. The reason why is advanced parole is discretionary in the sense that you can be issued the travel document, but when you present yourself at the border, the agent has much discretion deciding if he wants to allow you to enter the United States or not. So we are recommending that given, the current political climate and the fact that DACA has been rescinded, it's too risky to travel, even in the instance that you might have like a squeaky clean record just because it's so highly discretionary. And that certainly makes sense to me from stories I've heard from the border since, well, in particular this year. How about the rescission? And that's what's changed, right, as President Trump, and I'm almost putting this in quotation marks, but rescinded DACA. What does that mean? What did he announce last month?
So in his rescission of DACA, he basically said that he is not going to continue with the program. He did provide for a 6-month window of basically before actually completely terminating the program, which also meant that he allowed people whose DACA applications are expiring between September 5th, when he made the announcement of this year, all the way to March 5th, 2018, to renew their DACA before October 5th. These are all very important dates to remember. So he's basically giving, a 6-month period of those who expire during that time, and then giving them only a month to actually renew. So people who have their DACA expiring between September 5th and March 5th need to complete their applications before October 5th. Immigration has to have it filed with them by that date, but obviously we recommend not to take chances and to do that right away. The reason being we're motivating our clients doing it now, even though it's scary, is that because it is going to extend their deferment from their deferred action, and they will get another work permit that will be valid for an extra 2 years. DACA recipients whose DACA or work permits doesn't expire during that time frame that was provided by the rescission can continue to work until their EAD or until their work permits end up expiring.
So if someone has a work permit that expires in April of next year, at least under this current or based on this current announcement, they're out of luck.
Correct. That is correct.
They can't extend. They can continue to work for now, but they can't file an extension or a renewal, and they can't. Right now there's no promise that they'll be able to do anything after April.
Yes, correct. And that also goes for recipients whose DACA might have expired prior to September 5th. We actually had a workshop here this last Saturday at the law school, and we had many DACA applicants in both of those situations try to come forward and file. But USCIS has come out with basically their practice advisory saying that they will not renew for anybody who's expired outside of that time frame. So we're advising clients that even though it's frustrating, some of them wanted to continue trying. Obviously, it's up to them, but the application is $495, so they should consider that before renewing.
So they're all having to pay for $495 to file, plus, I guess, postage with some sort of receipt, so another $20 or so.
Yeah.
So it's an expensive process. And by the way, I would mention, because of this important deadline coming up of filing and having it accepted by October 5th, that there are, and I don't know if your organization is doing this, but there are these sort of DACA clinics popping up all over the country. I know there are about a dozen here in Georgia, including one at my law school. So are y'all doing that in LA?
Yeah, we held one this last Saturday, and then our clinic is doing, if we get calls for renewals, we will continue to renew those who are eligible until the deadline. I would recommend that if anyone's actually interested in, volunteering, to reach out to their local organizations, because there are many, many workshops going on. Our clinic is holding one, but also many of the immigrant rights organizations in Los Angeles are having basically DACA clinics almost daily until October 5th.
So all of you out there, you're mostly attorneys and legal professionals. So please, if you are interested, contact or do a little research and contact local organizations to try to help out if you can. I actually had a follow-up question. You were talking about this time frame for filing. So we had from September 5th through October 5th to file. And I know, I'm in Georgia where we had no electricity. Some of the people in my town had no electricity for a week recently during this 1 month period. I know in Houston there was flooding, in Florida a hurricane. So in light of these two hurricanes, Harvey and Irma, has there been any talk, and I don't know if Alan may have heard anything about this through American Immigration Lawyers Association liaison, but has there been any talk of extending the deadline, at least for people in Texas, Florida, and Georgia?
I have not heard anything, and given the current state of our administration and their stance, I actually believe that they're not going to budge on this. But I haven't heard anything to that effect.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would have been surprised too, but it is amazing considering the short window that people already have for suddenly coming up with $495 and filing something much earlier than they might otherwise. And having two hurricanes happen during the same period, it seems pretty inhumane to have things work out this way. But it's I guess we still have to help out to the extent that we can.
Yeah.
How about, is there anything else that you think people should know about the DACA rescission and how to file or how to work now, or do you think we've covered everything that you would like to point out to us in that regard?
Well, a couple of things is that, something that we've been telling clients is if you have any sort of complication, if you've been detained, by the time your last DACA application was approved, and now make sure that you seek out the help of an immigration attorney, especially anyone on the call who might be working with DACA applicants and sees, comes across an application that might have a complexity. Just because, before renewing, you want to make sure that you're not putting the individual at jeopardy. Also, something that I've just been motivating clients overall is that despite, how things are going right now, it's best to renew their DACA if they're eligible to, or in those who are not, to continue doing what they're doing, and try to come up with an action plan as to, in the event that that you're not able to renew your work permit, a DREAM Act doesn't pass, come up with an action plan as what are your next steps. We hate to think about, having to do family plans in the event of deportation, but these are just very real conversations you need to have now. And lastly, something that's incredibly beautiful about, the immigrant community as a whole, but in particular about, the DACA-mented community, is that I always remind them that they are incredibly resilient. And the reason why DACA was even created in the first place was due to their own personal advocacy. So regardless of what's going to come down these next couple of months, the best thing that we can do as a community, as attorneys, as recipients of DACA, is just continue advocating for the rights of the immigrant community.
That's a great point, and actually, I may have glossed over that too quickly, but President Obama didn't just decide to announce a DACA sort of executive action without any pushing. There was an awful lot of pushing before that happened. So that's a very good point, and there can be things that change going ahead as well, which I think. Oh, actually, I had one last question, Marissa, about the current program, and that is, if someone had a reason why they need to travel now and they wanted to risk it, are they still eligible to apply for advanced parole?
They are, from my understanding, they will no longer be processing advanced parole applications, and that also goes with initial DACA applications. It's only renewals, yeah. It's more in the instance that I have had clients who still have an advanced parole, which, allows them to travel during this time frame. The risk, is for them to take on, but I highly discourage it regardless of the emergency, just because it's so highly discretionary. And when you're at the border, you don't have a right to counsel. So then, my ability, for example, as an attorney is very limited as to what I can do to try to help them re-enter.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's very good advice, and it's good to know that they're not issuing. It's a bad thing, but it's good to know that they're not issuing additional advanced paroles going forward for DACA recipients. Alan, I'm curious. What do you, and actually either one of you, why do you think that President Trump decided to rescind DACA? What was going on there? Not that that's an easy question, but I am curious what you think is the motivation for this, and because I think that leads into what Alan's going to talk about what we can look for going forward.
So, Marissa, did you want to, or?
Oh, no, go for it.
Okay. So I think you're giving, it was a presidential promise, but I think you're sort of looking at the wrong person, the wrong actor. The real actor in this immigration fight across the board is going to be Jeff Sessions, who is sort of sitting at the head of the Department of Justice.
Right.
He has sort of made these policy decisions long before he sort of assumed this role. And during his time in this role, he's going to act very strongly against immigration policy across the board. And that would be, legal as well as what we call undocumented immigration. So once Jeff Sessions sort of finally had this memorandum and press conference, it sort of pushed the president in that direction to sort of say, this is unconstitutional, we must end it. But it's still legally among lawyers, if it was started under the president's, under Obama administration, and it was unconstitutional then, and it has been going on all this time for the Trump administration, and even he punted it. He has punted it down his administration for years. So let's talk about the class of people. There are around 800,000 DACA recipients. 84% of those recipients are of Hispanic background. 73% of them are female. 26% are male. 2% of them are white. 2% are black, and about 9% are Asian. And so in the sort of rollback of the DACA program, people will fall out at different times. So not all 800,000 people will fall out at one time. So maybe a class of 80 will be first, and then so on and so on. So that's really odd that if you think something's unconstitutional, you're going to continue it under your administration anyway. So that already gives me a clear sign, or it suggests to me that, what the Obama administration did, and they said was, this is a form of prosecutorial discretion, and that Trump is using that same discretion, and I think you may find him to use that same discretion if Congress doesn't come up with a solution. There's been a lot of rumbling that something's going to come out tomorrow with regards to where the White House and Congress is with regards to making amends to this issue, because I think there's a lot of confusion. And I think the very first thing we should do is step back and understand that Dreamers and the DREAM Act is a very large category of people, right? It's the Development Relief Education for Alien Minors. When DACA came about, DACA is a class of Dreamers, but a much smaller class than the full DREAM Act actually covered. And I think that's super important that people are sort of mixing these terms, because what's going to happen on the heel is this debate between give and get. Like, what are we going to give up for this class of people, and what's going to be on the table? And
Alan, you might also want to mention that I think what someone who qualifies, even in the smaller group who qualifies, what they get under DACA is a lot less than they would have gotten or would get under a DREAM Act, at least as it's been proposed up until now. Correct?
Exactly. At the very fine end of the DREAM, you would wind up with citizenship. And as we've already discussed, since DACA isn't a legislative policy, it's prosecutorial discretion, you're just getting nothing but the work authorization and maybe travel documents. But to have an understanding of that is really important for lawyers because the conflation of DACA and Dreamers really hurts the program, because what really happened in the Supreme Court last year was President Obama went to expand DACA to the full Dreamer class and include the parents in the class. And that's where the real issue got conflated and wound up in court, because Dreamers are a much larger category. And what the immigrant community doesn't want to do is to say, okay, we're going to give this 800,000 people this DREAM Act, forget everybody else, and then you give us a wall, because that's not a fair exchange, and that's not the sort of compromise that Democrats or people in the middle are sort of looking for with regard to this class of individuals. So keep that in the back of your mind as we sort of talk about what's going on. Now, what is important when advising clients, whether they be either DACA recipients or most likely companies that employ individuals who may have received this form of work relief, the easiest one to get out of the way are employers, right? Because employers do the same thing they do in all categories. All they have to do is 6 months before work authorization is expiring is to let the individual know that they will need to be renewing their work authorization at the time, and then that individual either will be able to present the documents that are needed to extend the work authorization or not. So as an employer, there's no need to sort of sort out who your DACA recipients are unless you're doing it for some other purpose. If you're doing it for a legislative purpose, or you just want to see, like you see Apple, Walmart, Target sort of say, Disney saying, you know, we have this class of people that are here, we think this number is this amount, and we're sort of lobbying it. But on the employment side, there's really nothing to do. On the individual side, and this is what really is super important for the bar to sort of step in, is that there are a lot of people who are practicing immigration law who are not attorneys, who are notaries and notarios, and as soon as they hear some act was introduced on the Hill, they start telling individuals to pay fees or signing them up for a program that doesn't exist. And the largest program out there right now that people are sort of hearing of something that may come about is the BRIDGE Act, and it stands for a bar removal of individuals who dream and grow our economy. And this is something that came from Graham and Durbin. And basically what it does is a legislative DACA, a little bit less than that, but still the concept is the same, except it's a legislative act that can't be taken away at the whim. And that's really what is at the heart of these considerations with DACA right now. If DACA is discretionary action, then any president can end it on any day without any conversation. And that works both ways. And we'll talk about the lawsuits that are coming up and some of the problems that I sort of see with them. But on Congress right now, there are a variety of different things that have been introduced in the House and in the Senate. But the real issue is the compromise, at least from what I've seen and what I've heard, there hasn't been a real clear decision on exactly what the dream class would be. And most things are called the DREAM Act or America's Hope Act. But the problem that we have on the Hill is the problem that I talked about earlier, is defining the classes of individuals that will receive these benefits. And also
Alan, who is it you mentioned earlier that there's going to be a meeting or announcement tomorrow? Which is that dealing with legislative action, and that's between the executive and members of Congress, or who is meeting tomorrow or announcing tomorrow?
I said there is an expectation that there will be a communication from the White House with regards to where the Republicans are as a party between the executive branch and the congressional branch as to where they are in the stakes of the battle, to sort of see if they're on the same page where things could maybe move forward, or if they're on different pages. And those considerations are the age, the requirements that are involved, what do you get at the end, right? Do you get citizenship, or do you just get to remain? And then how big will this class of people be, right? And so those are the things that are in the bills that you won't hear on the news, but it's important to understand when you're sort of talking about this category of people, like how many people are involved. And among these legislative problems are, how will they make the bill move? As you know, there's a budget bill that needs to move. The Democrats would like a standalone bill, so it's just a clean DREAM or BRIDGE Act bill, which sort of addresses the issue and just sort of codifies what Obama did in legislation and takes care of Jeff Sessions' concerns. On the public media side, people who supported the Trump administration see that as a lose, right? He promised he was going to remove these individuals. If he makes them sort of here legally and codifies it through the legislative branch, then that's problematic. It's also problematic and difficult to move a bill by a standalone bill by itself. By the end of the year, just a lot of complicated levers in there. And if you have been watching the news, right now the big focus is on health care and trying to get that sort of kicked off quickly. And then they're going to have to move directly to the budget because that's only extended to December 5th. Among those problems are some of the trade-offs that the administration may ask for, which you have heard are the wall and probably mandatory E-Verify, which is an employment verification system for all employers, which is done online. It's a government program in which employers will be required to, one, subscribe, and then every person you hire, you have to run them through the system. And just as a factual matter of someone who does this sort of work, everybody doesn't have a computer and internet. I mean, that's a very city and metro-centric way of thinking for employers to believe that everybody has the internet and everybody has a computer to sort of run people through. When you get down to the Deep South, there are a lot of farms and places where, you know, the internet's available, phones are available, but that's not part of their day-to-day practice. So that's one of the considerations for those type of employers. Outside of that, let's look at the courts and what remedies we can sort of see in the courts. And so one of the first class you're going to see are from actual dreamers. And then similar to that, you're going to see about 15 states that are sort of similar to the dreamers in making an argument that Trump's action is based on racism against Mexicans and Hispanics. And that's pretty much the full basis of their legal argument.
So how about, I've heard some arguments about the Administrative Procedures Act.
Poliano, I mean, it may be in it's mentioned in the state's case, but it's more Napolitano's. Jen Napolitano, who was the Attorney General at the time this was enacted, is also suing based on herself in a class of universities, and that is her first consideration of saying that this didn't follow the Procedures Act.
And where would that get us? Because it seems to me like all that would do would be open things up and allow some renewals, maybe in a delay, but it would just mean following procedures to correct things. Is that right, or am I missing something with regard to that claim?
Right. So I think, you know, we're all lawyers. We all have our own sort of constitutional build and administrative act sort of built from this. And for me, the standard is so high because the premise of DACA is a discretionary act by the president. In suing the president to change a discretionary act, that position, the standard would have to be pretty high, which would be some abusive animus, race-based sort of analysis. It sort of happened also that we sort of might, you know, notice with the travel ban. I think that standard is pretty difficult, and even having the Administrative Procedures Act buys you nothing except for, okay, so now we go through this notice and comment.
Right.
Right.
So that's not a permanent or a long-term solution. That would be, at the very best, it would be a sort of a delay, I guess, while people go through to follow the appropriate procedure.
Right. The only thing it would add to is building the record for the animus sort of part of the record, which could turn to another argument, but it's definitely a delay tactic. And once again, in the overall immigration consideration, this is the low-hanging fruit. This was supposed to be the easiest class of individuals to migrate because, you know, they weren't involved in their status in the United States. And sort of the time frames of these individuals, some of these individuals came in, you know, when they were 6 months old, and today they're 21, 25. So just imagine the time frames that we're sort of talking about with individuals being here. So those are the major lawsuits that I see sort of happening on the cusp. I don't see them as winners. You know, I see them as tactics, but I don't see them as winners. The big win, as in all cases, would be legislation. And in my sort of years of practicing immigration, you know, a Republican Congress has always been the body that passes the most comprehensive act, although they may be horrible in the end, and, you know, IRA, for example. But that's sort of what we're on right now, is this sort of legislative act. And to see, because I think tomorrow we should see, because the executive branch, after the backlash, and specifically a lot of backlash from corporate clients and from the Hispanic part of his affiliation, have said this was a bad move, that he may change his stance and extend DACA in some other way. And that may be what's sort of coming out tomorrow, because this is causing a lot of anxiety to people, as you said before, regardless of the storms. Just the concept of, now I have to wonder if comprehensive immigration is going to happen, and what does it mean to me?
Right, and so you think that there is some chance that he might actually announce a change of policy from the executive side soon, as opposed to waiting until Congress fails and in March or whenever.
Yeah, I think the pressure in the press has been bad, and I also think that, once again, sort of, I gave you the demographics of the classification because it is a lot of young ladies and women who are being most impacted by this, right? And so just the face of it is not good. And he's already basically said on television that, these are individuals who did not come to the United States on their own. They're hardworking. They're as American as anyone else. The only thing they don't have are their documents.
Yeah, and their stories are so compelling. I mean, that's one of the things that got DACA to happen initially. You could pick out any 5 stories. How compelling the stories are of the people, of the dreamers, of the people who fit in these categories, and that makes it difficult for politicians when they're really faced with those individual stories, I think. So that's a tool in the arsenal of those who want protection going forward, I think. Well, we'll all listen out tomorrow and see what might happen. Fridays have been big news days recently, so maybe we'll actually hear something good tomorrow. Marissa, did you have anything to add about what we should expect going forward? Anything that you know about or would want us to think about other than what Alan just covered?
Yeah, well, the only thing that I would add is that it's unfortunate because, yes, DACA recipients' dreamers were kind of like the low-hanging fruit in the sense that, they were the most admirable immigrant. And something that I just want to keep in mind is that, now this new administration is taking advantage of that and is basically, using them as a bargaining chip. And my concern, too, is that, whatever type of comprehensive immigration reform goes forward, even though it may be very favorable to DACA recipients, is going to have a lot of new provisions and language that is going to be very hurtful for the immigrant community. For example, the House, introduced a bill called H.R. 3697, which was the criminal alien gang. I forget the exact name of it, but basically the new bill that they introduced would basically making membership an explicit immigration bar. And I think this is an example of, ways that the administration and also Republicans are trying to push forward, different bars or different immigration, different issues of reform in exchange for DACA recipients. And what's pretty, scary about this bill in particular is that it's incredibly broad and has a very broad definition of what qualifies as a gang member, which would also affect not only kids, like the unaccompanied minors who entered, but also many DACA recipients that in the event that they fall out of status due to how broad the definition is, can actually be classified as gang members based solely on, family relationships or even, if they come from low-income urban neighborhoods. So I just think that we should really keep an eye out for that type of stuff and advocate against it, also because it's kind of happening covertly. For example, this bill hasn't picked up much traction or news because everyone has been so preoccupied with DACA.
Right, and so we should really watch the language of whatever legislation or other announcement we're hearing about when it comes out. I think it's a good point too that these compromises, whenever we've gotten one step forward, we've usually had 2 steps backward in whatever compromise in immigration over the past generation, whether it was amnesty during the 1980s at the same time that IRCA passed, which first provided some really serious enforcement in ways that had not occurred before, or whether it's looking even farther back at the end of the sort of racial bar and quota regime in the 1960s, at the same time when more restrictions happened on immigration from our hemisphere. So I think we should definitely keep our eyes open about what's hidden in the Trojan horse that people put before us. Mm-hmm. All of that said, I think it's also really important to remember that we are are talking about, around 800,000 really, deserving people who I hope can be helped in some way. Did y'all have anything else to add before I go to Paul for questions?
Yeah, I forgot to say that, it's an estimated, just like in regular population, that 10% of these DACA recipients are gay, lesbian, transgender, or some other classification. So I think,
No, that's a good point, and there have been, I guess, some, there have been some particular issues that people have run into related to their, to being arrested in some cases because that were related to, say, their transgender status and problems with finding other employment. There have been, there are some ways in which this really does affect the LGBT community more than other communities as well. I actually heard a story yesterday of someone I had not heard of before who did not sign up for DACA and will therefore miss the chance to renew now. But because this person is over the age of 22, but someone who was sex trafficked as a child from Eastern Europe in this case, and has been in the United States for almost 20 years, I guess, would have qualified under DACA, but did not. Paul, could you give us any questions that you've received? Have you been getting questions from our listeners there?
Yes, I have gotten a couple, and I'm going to ask them. And I guess I will also remind listeners, we don't have too much time for them, but if they have any questions that they want asked, please email me at paul@lgbtbar.org, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them. If not, I will certainly pass them along to you all with the hope that you can answer them for them. But with that, why don't I get to the first question, which might be a little long, that I received to see what you have to say. And this question is, assuming there is no legislation or executive action to replace DACA, how does the Trump administration's elimination of the Obama-era removal priorities affect DACA recipients? And has the current administration adopted some de facto set of removal priorities that would give us hope that the administration will not use the information provided to the government from DACA recipients to deport them and their families?
Well, those are great questions. Which one of you wants to take those? Alan, do I hear you?
Yeah, so there are suits about suppression of the information provided to DACA recipients, but you should know that under the Trump administration, everyone who's here that's undocumented, as you heard from or you might not have heard from the head of ICE, is subject to removal. So what happens now is consequential arrest, which means someone comes in to arrest Tom, but Tom isn't there, and instead they get Sam and Mike and Sue, and they all go down, and they're just basically Sam, Mike, and are not a party at all. And I don't do removal work that often, but a lot of my clients now are experiencing this from the employment side, where they're missing workers because the workers were picked up because ICE was looking for someone else. So the priorities have already changed, and there is they have expressed it, they have shown it, and there are stories that are popping up about DACA recipients being removed. And part of that, I'm a black person, so I don't mind saying that, is just related to things that happen to people of color in their interaction with the law. And just because the standard is so low for this class of people, any interaction by an officer causes problems. And specifically, if you look at the dynamics between the number of female DACA recipients and the number of male DACA recipients, it speaks quite loud to that problem.
And that's a good point. I would add that the Trump administration is trying to reinvigorate cooperation between ICE and local law enforcement, which will, in a similar way to what Alan was talking about, it could lead to more people who coming into or avoiding contact with local law enforcement whenever they're victims of a crime or witnesses of a crime. because there's this announced policy or this preference for deporting anyone who comes within their consciousness, as opposed to just people who've committed serious crimes. So that's another area in which to worry. I think we don't have any good news on in response to that question, unless Marissa does. You don't have any good news, do you?
I wish that I had, but what I would say too, that what's indicative that the Trump administration will in fact go after Dreamers is the fact that Obama had instituted prosecutorial discretion when it came to removal proceedings. Where basically trial attorneys or ICE could say, this person is not a priority for removal because they don't have criminal convictions. And it wasn't for anybody that was placed in removal. But ICE is now actively opening those cases and reinstating removal proceedings against those individuals. So I wish I had something more optimistic to say, but I do not. Also, just based on my own personal experience with my clients, I've had clients whose cases have been closed for a long time, victims of trafficking that get reopened, so very sympathetic cases. And but it's been clear that, as everyone has said on this call, everyone under the Trump administration is fair game. If you're undocumented, that in itself is grounds from removal from the United States, and this administration does consider you a priority for enforcement, regardless of the fact that you have family members paying taxes, have no criminal convictions.
And what do you, and this is the second part of that question, I think, but what is y'all's sense with regard to the sharing of information? I mean, these people, when they came forward and applied under the DACA action, were promised explicitly or implicitly that, and I think it was explicit, that the information would not be used against them. It wouldn't be sent to ICE in order to find them out. What is y'all's sense about the way the current administration will deal with that information?
Yeah. Well, it was made, or at least, under the Obama administration, it was made, I would say, clear that, in certain circumstances, because they did hold it that, that they are at liberty to share information with ICE if it was a person of extreme interest. Right. But it can change, it's definitely changed under the Trump administration, and there's no necessary safeguards that say that they won't go after this information. And I've had clients be very concerned about it, and that's why I tell them, okay, they have your information already, so you might as well renew. But also, secondly, go get a consultation, because you never know. Many of these DACA recipients might qualify for other forms of relief. This is just another little heads up. For example, the story you shared, that's someone that would qualify for a T visa as a victim of trafficking. I've also had many DACA recipients who end up qualifying for special immigrant juvenile status. So I highly recommend that now is the time to get a full immigration consultation, because there might be things you can take advantage of at this moment.
And that's great advice.
Yeah.
Paul, do you have other questions?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more, and this is the other question that I received. It is, what exactly was Attorney General Jeff Sessions' rationale for determining that DACA would not survive a legal challenge, and in your opinion, would that challenge to DACA have been successful?
That's a great question, too. Do one of y'all want to take that, or? I'm hearing silence. I think, first of all, I think it's interesting to conjecture about it at this point, because it's really a moot point at this point, because they just decided. I mean, I think that was lip service, really. I mean, as Alan pointed out, there's hypocrisy in the fact that they said it's unconstitutional to do this, but we're going to continue doing it for 6 months, right? So I don't think they really believe that, or at least they're not convinced of it. How it would have turned out, I personally doubt that lawsuit would have been successful. I certainly don't think it was such a slam dunk that the administration had to cave if they had not wanted to. Clearly they wanted to. It happened to correspond with their own political direction, especially Jeff Sessions. but I would never conjecture on a new question. And the U.S. Supreme Court, it's as I think Judge Posner said as he was stepping down, and I think that was announced last month as well. It's a political court. And I think there is it's very difficult to guess where the court would go on an issue like that. One could, but I wouldn't try to do that. But it's certainly an open question. They didn't have to do what they did. It had not been decided. It was a political decision, not a in spite of the announcement, it was not a legal decision in and of itself.
Right. And so, Scott, this is Alan, and it really depends on where you sit, because US v. Texas provides or informs to give practitioners some concern about how a pure DACA case would have resulted at the Supreme Court just based on the follow-through of expanding the class. And so people were troubled.
Do you have any other questions for us, Paul? Or
no, I think that's it, but we're basically at a full hour now anyway. So I, one more time, just want to thank our panelists for taking the time today to do this call-in. And I'll just tell our listeners that our organizations cannot continue putting together quality programming like this call without your continued support. If you'd like to see more cutting-edge legal analysis, please consider becoming a member or renewing your existing memberships to the LGBT Bar and the HMBA. But we need the support of our communities and our allies now more than ever. To learn more, please visit our website. Thank you.